Paula, welcome to the Leaning Forward conference. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, it's good to be with you. I'm Paula Stone Williams. I am a transgender woman, transitioned about 10 years ago. I'm a pastoral counselor. I've been a pastor. I'm also a coach of pastors. I also am a coach for the largest TEDx in North America and work with them also as a curator, MC. I'm a speaker's ambassador for TED and a pastoral counselor. I think I said that already. So, yeah, that's kind of who I am. I live in Boulder County, Colorado. I think it's important for us to understand that there are only three moral standards of our species. The first moral standard, the most ancient, is that there is no greater moral good than to protect the integrity of the tribe. And this is still the moral standard of many developing nations. The second moral standard, second oldest, is that there is no greater moral good than to obey the teachings of the gods. And this is the moral standard of all forms of fundamentalism, wherever you find it in the world, whatever the religion is, all forms of fundamentalism. There's no greater moral good than to obey the teachings of the gods. The third moral standard is the youngest, is specific to the Western world, and in my opinion, is born out of the teachings of Jesus. And it is that there is no greater moral good than to protect the integrity and freedom of the individual. This is, in fact, what has developed the United States as a nation. It would be the major secular moral standard of our nation. It'd be the moral standard of the East Coast, the West Coast. It is not the moral standard of most forms of fundamentalism. Unfortunately, most forms of fundamentalism have that second moral standard, that there's no greater moral good than to obey the teachings of the gods. Now, you have to add to that one other very important understanding. Edward O. Wilson was a sociobiologist who taught at MIT and Harvard, just passed away last year. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. His first was in identifying that the key social unit for the human species is not, in fact, the nuclear family, it's the tribe. And the second Pulitzer Prize was in identifying that there are only 9 species who are tribal species. Every species has what Richard Dawkins would call a selfish gene, but he says that these 9 species also have a tribal gene, that they will sacrifice themselves for the sake of the tribe. Enemy comes into the camp, they unite, they defeat the enemy, some of them die, but the tribe goes on. He says now 8 of these 9 tribal species, he calls them eusocial species, that's spelled Eusocial. He says 8 of the 9 tribal species have evolved as you would expect, but the 9th tribal species have evolved in ways you would not have expected. And that is that the 9th tribal species believe an enemy is necessary for the tribe to survive. And where no natural enemy exists, they create one. Wilson said, we don't get a hold of this, we lose that species, and we lose the planet as we know it. So if you combined this tendency of that species, humans, along with that second of the 3 moral standards, or the first of the 3 moral standards, and you end up with entities that will create enemies that don't exist and will believe that they must obey the teachings of the gods in their interpretation of those teachings. That is not at all compatible with the teachings of Jesus or the third moral standard, that there's no greater moral good than to protect the freedom and integrity of the individual. So religion, in fact, plays a major part in working against what the US Constitution is all about. Yeah, I'm one of the very few people out there who understands what it means to be a leader in the patriarchal world, and also what it means to no longer have that position of privilege within the patriarchal world. And there is no way a well-educated white male can understand how much the culture is tilted in his favor. There's no way he can understand it because it's all he's ever known and all he ever will know. Conversely, there's no way for a woman to understand the full import of that because being a woman is all she's ever known. Now, she might have an inkling. She's working twice as hard for 81% as much, but she has no idea how much more difficult it is for her than it is for the guy in the Brooks Brothers jacket in the office across the hall. I know I was that guy. And if I could go back and talk to Paul, I think there are three things that I would say to Paul. The first is learn the value of deference. Women learn deference almost as a birthright. Men are taught that deference is weakness. But until men can see deference as a positive personality attribute, we'll never achieve gender equity. The beginning of deference is by being an ally, by saying to women, I'm here, I'm with you, I'll work for you, I'll do what needs to be done. But that's not deference. Because as an ally, you're still the one in charge of what it is you're going to do or say. Deference doesn't even begin until you move from being an ally to an apprentice. Until you are willing to work the direction of the women in your world and say to them, what is it that you need me to do? So that's the first thing I wish I had learned was deference. I think the second thing I wish I had learned as a guy was the value of compromise, correction, and collaboration. What is it that Germany, Norway, Finland, Iceland, Taiwan, and New Zealand have in common? All 6 of those nations did extremely well in the first year of the coronavirus. All 6 also happen to have a female head of state. A head of state who worked collaboratively with health departments instead of seeing them as subordinates, who was willing to compromise, not for the best solution, but for a workable solution. And my favorite, were willing to accept correction. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand was particularly adept at this. If they went in the wrong direction, she said, that didn't work. Let's go this way instead. Now, contrast that with the 3 countries that did spectacularly poorly in the first year of the coronavirus: Brazil, the United States, and Great Britain. Do I need to say any more? And the third thing I wish I could go back and say to Paul is learn the value of truly, deeply listening. I'm a pastoral counselor. I work from what's called person-centered therapy. That's a perspective that says that you as a counselor have no answers. Your client has the answers. Your job is to help them remove the obstacles that are stopping them from finding their own answers. Can't do that if you don't truly listen. I wish I could go back and tell Paul that. But I also have to admit there's some things that I like to tell women that I think are pretty important. First of all, my discovery was that women do not empower one another. Men do empower one another. Women do not. They see each other as competition. Now, I understand the reason. Average woman earns 81 cents on the dollar of what the average white man earns in this nation. 5.8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. 22% of senior vice presidents are women. 6.6% of Silicon Valley CEOs are women. 2% of directors, 11% of writers, 19% of producers are women. 47% of first and second year law associates are women. Only 15% make partner. 3% of venture capital goes to female founded firms. I could go on and on. I understand then why women tend to see the world from a lens of scarcity. But that does not help us achieve gender equity. I think we've got to empower one another. It's interesting, I was talking with Keke Addison, who was a reporter at the Washington Post, and I was there for an interview when my memoir came out. And I said this, and she said in the first day, it was a 2-day interview, and she said the first day, well, that's not my experience. My experience is women do empower one another. So I came back day 2 for the photography part of the interview, and she said, I have an apology I have to make to you. I was talking to Madeleine Albright last night, as one does, I suppose. And she said that, told her what you said, and she said, oh yeah, don't you remember all the times I've said there's a special place in hell for women who do not empower one another? So I think that's what I would say to women. Also, I would say to women, stop teaching our daughters to be perfect. We teach our sons to be confident. We teach our daughters to be perfect. We think we're doing them a favor. We're not. They get out into the first corporate job, position opens up in the company, has 5 requirements. They have 4 of the 5 because they've been taught to be perfect. They think they cannot apply for the position because they don't have the 5th. We teach our sons to be confident. They see the posting. They know they have 2 out of 5 requirements, and they think to themselves, I got this, because they've been taught that they do. So they apply for the job and get the job that the woman is twice as qualified for, but wouldn't even apply in the first place because she wasn't perfect. Stop teaching our daughters to be perfect. Teach them to be persistent. And third, women, stop apologizing and own what you know. The imposter syndrome is ubiquitous to the human species. All of us experience it. Men are 75% less likely to admit it, but we all experience it. We all were created with a deep neurobiological need for human connection. Unfortunately, we all think there's something about us that makes us unworthy of that deep human connection. And that is reinforced time and again throughout the growing younger years and really throughout life for women. It is not reinforced for men. I think I've apologized for myself more in the last 10 years than I did in the previous decades. I have to say to myself often, Paula, you don't have to apologize for being right. So, there are plenty of things I say on both sides, to both men and women, that will narrow the gap that exists with patriarchal leadership. Toxic theology is theology that is confident of itself. Scott Peck always used to say that 99.9% of the evil done in the world is done by those who are convinced they are 100% right. And so you take a look at the power that evangelical Christianity has in the United States today, or fundamentalist Islam has in the Middle East, and you have one particular religion, not just one religion, but one particular interpretation of one particular religion that ends up having incredible political power. And that becomes very, very toxic. Unfortunately, we don't realize in America that 52% of Christians are actually supportive of the LGBTQ community. Only 48% are not. It's just that 48% are the most vocal. That is evangelical Christians. Truth is, 72% of Catholics believe that marriage equality is appropriate for the nation. 62% of mainline Protestants believe that to be true. 51% of historically African-American denominations believe it to be true. But only 37% of evangelicals believe that marriage equality should be the law of the land. Interestingly, however, though, 51% of millennial evangelicals believe that marriage equality should be the law of the land. So we're seeing a shift. The one thing I think that needs to be said about the over 590 laws that were proposed and over 80 signed into law, anti-transgender laws, just in 2023, who's driving those laws? Most people assume it's Republicans. It's not. 61% of Republicans in one study, 62% in another study, said that transgender people should have the same civil rights as everybody else. So who then is driving these laws? Granted, it's Republican legislatures passing these laws, but who is pushing them to? It is quite specifically evangelical Christians, 87% of whom believe gender is immutably determined at birth, 67% of whom believe we already give transgender people too many civil rights, and yet only 31% of whom actually know someone who's out as a transgender person. So it's important to understand this is very specifically being driven by a small segment of the American population, evangelical Christianity, but they have placed themselves in positions of power, and that is hurting the freedoms of the rest of us. I think the best way to advocate for an abuse survivor who's coming from the LGBTQ plus environment is to fully embrace them and make as few references to their LGBTQ status as possible. Most of us don't really want to talk about that. We want to be known for all the other things we do. If you note, when I talked about who I am and what I do, I did not say that I am an advocate for the LGBTQ community, because that is not a primary goal or purpose of mine. I certainly am in a position to be able to do much for that community, and I'm happy to do so. But I appreciate that in most of the worlds I inhabit, I'm just Paula. So I ran for public office here in the town in which I live in Colorado. And so now I serve on the town board. And our mayor was talking not long ago about hoping that every one of us will run again next year. And I said, well, I likely will, but there's no guarantee I'll be elected. We're kind of a purple town, and it's a different world than it was last time around. A lot of anti-transgender sentiment. At which point the mayor and I think it was three of our board members said, "Oh, that's right. We always forget you're transgender." See, that is what makes me comfortable. The church that I have been a part of for the last 6 years, it's a church where it just never comes up who's gay and who's not, who's trans, who's not, who's non-binary, who's not. And that is the way in which we want to be embraced, just as a human, where our sexual identity or gender identity is incidental. I think there really are only two things that will, in fact, break down the barriers that are existing in the United States and are widening, and really much of the world right now. There's such polarization, and I think there are only two things that will break it, and that is proximity and narrative. I coached a speaker at TED Vancouver in 2022 who teaches at MIT and Princeton, taught a course at MIT this the spring semester, proximity and narrative, about breaking down the barriers. We're a story-based species. We don't sleep without dreaming. We don't dream in mathematical equations. We dream in stories. And I believe that it's primarily through story that we will change the narrative. If you think about it, how did marriage equality come about? And how did it happen so quickly? I think we actually can thank television for that, and scripted television at that. I believe it started with All in the Family, moved from there to the scripted Ellen Show, from there to Will and Grace, and from there to Modern Family. And in each one of those was a progression until we get to Modern Family, where the fact that one couple is gay is incidental to what's happening in that family. That is, in fact, I think, the most effective way to do it, because scripted shows draw you in to the narrative. So a year ago this month, I had the privilege to sit down with about 60 Hollywood writers and talk about how they might be able to do the same with transgender people. And of course, what we said to them was, just have us as characters who just happen to be transgender. That is, I think, how we can electronically create narrative and proximity, but ultimately it won't happen electronically. It will happen when we make sure we're in the same room together and we can listen to each other's stories. So just a few months ago, I was coaching and emceeing for a large TEDx and was working with a Republican district attorney. And when I began working with him, I was suspicious of him, and I'm quite sure he was suspicious of me. But as we began to work together, we really developed quite an affinity and a good friendship. And I knew at our dress rehearsal day, when he introduced me to his two young children, that everything had changed for both of us. I did not see him as a right-wing Republican from one of the most conservative counties in the state of Colorado. I saw him as Mike. And he did not see me as a transgender woman. He saw me as his TED coach. And that kind of proximity, I think, is how we can bring about the healing. I think that the single most important thing that I would say to men is, assume a woman knows what she's talking about and treat her accordingly. That, first and foremost. Second, stop interrupting us. Men interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men. Women interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt men. So stop interrupting us. And also, I know, guys, that you're working hard. I worked hard to get my education. I worked hard to get to the top of my field. I worked really hard. What I never understood was I began closer to the finish line than anyone else. So you're allowed to own how hard you've worked. Just recognize you began closer to the finish line than the rest of the world. Oh, I think that what comes to mind is actually David Whyte's poem, Sweet Darkness. When your eyes are tired, the world is tired also. When your vision has gone, no part of the world can find you. It's time to go into the dark, where the night has eyes to recognize its own. There you can be sure you are not beyond love. The dark will be your home tonight. The night will give you a horizon further than you can see. You must learn one thing. This is why I memorized this poem. You must learn one thing. The world was made to be free in. You must give up all the other worlds except the one to which you belong. Sometimes it takes darkness and the sweet confinement of your aloneness to learn that anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you. Thank you.
Many of us spend our lives searching for worth, value, and security through doing enough. It's time to discover a new way of living and becoming where we remember that we are human beings, not human doings. Embark on a powerful journey towards presence and authenticity, learning how to be where you are and who you are. Because after all, being is not a destination. It is an ongoing and meaningful adventure.